War has returned to Europe. In the early hours of Thursday, Russian tanks and troops rolled across the border in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Just moments after their president, Vladimir Putin, announced on television he would launch a so-called special military operation.
On February 24, 2022, Russia announced it would be conducting a specialized military operation in Ukraine, launching a full-scale war. Tensions had been running high ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and what we are currently seeing is the result of decades of tension, pressure, and uncertainty. Scholars and academics alike have commented on the war, and the most notable explanations come from constructivist and realist theories. Constructivists believe that the identity, norms, beliefs, and values that states have influence how states behave, and the system within which states interact is subjective and does not have a fixed meaning. Realism, on the other hand, holds that states are in a perpetual state of anarchy, and their main goal is survival. Each state is an independent actor, sometimes referred to as billiard balls, only looking out for itself and ensuring it maintains its sovereignty. This video essay will examine the constructivist and realist explanations for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the constructivist explanation being the different identities found within Ukraine, and the realist explanation being the threat that NATO and Ukraine pose to Russia's security. As we will see, while both narratives hold true in why Russia invaded, the most fitting narrative is realism's proposed insecurity of Russia. The constructivist explanation for Russia's invasion regards the competing identities found within Ukraine. A census from 2001 found that there were 14.3 million, or 29% of the population of Ukrainians whose first language was Russian. As for ethnicity, 17.8% identified as ethnically Russian, 77.8% identified as ethnically Ukrainian, and all other ethnic identities comprised only 4.4% of the population. From this map, you can see that the areas in eastern Ukraine are predominantly Russian-speaking Ukrainians. These areas include Crimea, which was invaded in 2014, and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which are collectively called the Donbass. This is a timeline of the military activity and occupations by both Russians and Ukrainians since the start of the war. Notably, most of the activity is occurring in the eastern regions of Ukraine, where the majority of the Russian-speaking population resides. Since 2014, Crimea has been occupied by Russian forces, while Donetsk and Luhansk have been occupied by pro-Russian separatists. May Darwich and Tamarachi Fakuri explain the role of identity in the conflict through securitization theory. Securitization theory is a constructivist theory, and the authors frame it through religious identity, but it can also be applied to overall identity. Darwich and Fakuri explain how securitization occurs when political elites portray a religious, sectarian other as a threat, whereby conventional politics cannot protect the state and extraordinary measures are required to quash the threat. Put in simpler terms, securitization has three characteristics. It is 1. A speech act that 2. Presents a strategic act, and 3. Is accepted by the audience. In the case of Ukraine, Putin has casted, or portrayed, Ukrainians as a threat to ethnic Russians within Ukraine. Putin has crafted the existential threat narrative by calling Ukrainians, on numerous occasions, Nazis who are committing a genocide against ethnic Russians, therefore requiring extraordinary military intervention and the need to denazify Ukraine. In this clip from his televised address on the day of the invasion, he claims that Kiev has perpetrated a genocide for 8 years and is seeking the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. An issue with this constructivist argument is that Putin has simultaneously been adamant that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, neglecting their distinctness. In an article he wrote from July 2021, he says, "I consider the wall that emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between parts of essentially one historic and cultural space, as one big, common problem, as a tragedy." And on March 3rd of this year, he said in a statement to Russia's Security Council, "I will never reject my conviction that Russians and Ukrainians are one people." These statements are evidence of the dissonant attitudes that Putin has towards Ukrainians. On the one hand, they are no different than Russians, but on the other, they are Nazis committing a genocide against his countrymen, and have left him no choice but to use military force. The issue with the constructivist argument that identity is the driving force in the conflict is twofold. For one, the majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Russians themselves oppose Putin's war. A poll from 2012 found that 40% of Ukrainians said Russian was their native language, and 57% of them said that Ukrainian was their primary language. After the invasion, however, a new poll showed that 76% of Russian-speaking Ukrainians said Ukrainian was their primary language, with 20% saying they still used Russian, and 33% saying that they plan on switching to Ukrainian exclusively. Remember, one of the key elements of securitization theory that Darwich and Fakuri note is that the portrayal of a group as a threat is accepted by the audience, but that is evidently not the case here. The other issue with this argument is that Putin has expressed dissonance about how Russia actually views Ukraine. On the one hand, he says there is no difference between Ukrainians and Russians, but on the other, he says that Ukrainians are Nazis that are intent on murdering ethnic Russians. It would appear that even Putin might be having a hard time convincing himself of the Ukrainian threat, and perhaps it is arguable that his weaponization of identity as a factor in invading Ukraine is not a driving cause in the war, but rather is an ill-founded attempt to sway the Russian people to be in favor of it. The realist view, on the other hand, provides a better explanation for what is currently happening in Ukraine. The realist explanation sees the conflict as an example of the security dilemma. Barry Posen explains that the security dilemma occurs when one state does something to enhance its own security, but it causes reactions that, in turn, make it less secure. In the case of Russia and Ukraine was trying to join NATO to feel more secure, but that in turn resulted in Russia taking action, making Ukraine less secure. The reason Russia felt the need to pursue military action can be boiled down to the simple fact that NATO represents everything Russia has been starkly against, the West and all things Western, and poses an additional risk to its own security. From the map below, you can see that NATO membership has been steadily increasing over the last few decades, moving closer and closer to Russia's borders. While the security dilemma explains the sequence of actions leading up to Russia's invasion, it is also evidence of the principles of realist theory. As I mentioned before, the paramount assumption of realism is anarchy. John Mearsheimer is a prominent offensive realist who articulates the dynamics of states in such a condition of anarchy. From his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he says, states can never be certain of other states' intentions. In this vein, the uncertainty about other states' intentions directly reflects the primary goal of states, survival. Mearsheimer explains how security is maintained through their territorial integrity and the autonomy of their domestic political order. Russia views the eastern regions of Ukraine as part of Russia, and the NATO expansion pushed him to take action to ensure his own security. Mearsheimer has also directly commented on the crisis that's currently happening in Ukraine, quite controversially. 8 years ago, at the time when Russia invaded Crimea, he said that the West had only themselves to blame for the event in an essay conveniently titled, "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault." In it, he says, "The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate it into the West." While many thought Mearsheimer had a bad take on the crisis, it turned out to be true, straight from the mouth of Putin himself. From the same televised address on the day of the invasion, he says,
Начну с того, о чем говорил в своем обращении от 21 февраля текущего года. Речь о том, что вызывает у нас особую озабоченность и тревогу. О тех фундаментальных угрозах, которые из года в год, шаг за шагом, грубо и бесцеремонно создаются безответственными политиками на Западе в отношении нашей страны. Имея в виду расширение блока НАТО на восток, приближение его военной инфраструктуры к российским границам.
Putin blamed the West again in a speech on May 9th, saying, "Russia called on the West for an honest dialogue, reasonable compromise solutions in interest of each other, but that was in vain. The NATO countries did not want to hear us, and that means that in fact they had very different plans, and we could see that." The other plans that Putin mentions indicate his distrust for NATO and skepticism about what their intentions are for Ukrainian membership, exemplifying the uncertainty of other states and the thirst for survival mentioned by Mearsheimer. As we have seen, the realist explanation that Russia invaded due to the threat the West poses is superior to that of the constructivist. This is because the constructivist explanation that identity is the driving force is a supplementary argument that can fit itself under the umbrella of the realist explanation. Here, I mean the Ukrainian identity poses a threat to ethnically Ukrainian Russians, and consequently, Russia itself. Now, who's to say that either the constructivist or realist explanation are the truest for Russia's invasion? On the one hand, Putin may be using identity as a means to an end to attempt to ensure Russian support for the war. On the other, Putin may be playing into Westphalian conceptions of IR theory by using NATO enlargement and the West as a scapegoat. In either event, the realist explanation is the most fitting for the current crisis, and we can only hope that these two countries can make it to the negotiating table.